6 times, Ted Cruz tried to silence her. But on the 7th, Jasmine Crockett unleashed a line so powerful, the entire chamber froze. It began in the middle of testimony. When Cruz leaned forward with that trademark smirk, his voice slicing through the air like a man convinced the rules applied only to others. He didn't wait for Crockett to finish her sentence. He didn't ask for recognition. He simply bulldozed over her words, the sound of his interruption echoing like a gavel slammed. In arrogance. For a split second, the room shifted. Staffers glanced up, pens froze on paper, cameras zoomed in. The interruption wasn't just about procedure, it was about power. Cruz wanted dominance, and he wanted it immediately. Jasmine Crockett, though, didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed. Her posture tightened, but her voice, steady, deliberate, cut right back through the noise. She refused to be drowned out, refused to be treated as though her words were disposable. It was a sharp reaction, controlled but fierce, the kind of silence breaking. Defiance that carries centuries of weight. You could see the irritation flicker across Cruz's face. He leaned in again, trying to reassert himself, but Crockett's composure only magnified the imbalance. In that moment, she wasn't just answering a senator, she was embodying every woman, every person of color, every working-class fighter who has ever been told to wait their turn while men like Cruz claimed the floor. The tension was palpable, almost cinematic. Every interruption became a battle in miniature. Each word Crockett fought to finish became a statement larger than the hearing itself. Viewers across the country, watching in real time, felt the weight of it. One man's arrogance colliding with one woman's unshakable resolve, and this was only the first strike. Cruz's voice, sharp and impatient, carried the entitlement of someone convinced he could keep silencing her until she relented. But Crockett's presence made it clear. This wasn't going to be one of those days. Not for her. Not for America. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if Cruz would back down or if Crockett would rise higher. But that was only the beginning. Because Cruz wasn't done interrupting. And America wasn't ready for what happened. Next, the hearing wasn't just another day on Capitol Hill. It was about oversight, accountability, and the fragile heartbeat of democracy itself. At stake was the question of whether those in power could be held to the same standards as the people they governed, or whether the machinery of privilege would once again grind truth into silence. The committee room was heavy with expectation. Every seat packed, every lens trained on the lawmakers, the nation tuned in not just to hear answers, but to witness a test of America's democratic resilience. And there, at the center, was Ted Cruz. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, with the ease of a man who had spent years treating the Senate floor like a stage built solely for his performance. Cruz didn't just speak, he maneuvered. He stretched questions into speeches, clipped answers short, interrupted at will. Each tactic was designed not to clarify, but to dominate, to stall, to remind everyone watching that he believed the rules bent in his direction. It was less about oversight, more about theater, a theater where arrogance wrote the script. For Cruz, delay wasn't a byproduct, it was the point. Every interruption he hurled at Jasmine Crockett was calculated. Cut her momentum, rattle her composure, steal the spotlight. But Crockett refused to play his game. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Instead, she became a counterweight to his arrogance. Her calm tone deflating his theatrics with the kind of precision that only comes from lived resilience. To the millions watching from living rooms, classrooms, and offices across the country, Crockett's presence wasn't just procedural. It was deeply personal. She was more than a congresswoman. She was the daughter of working-class grit, the voice of those who had been told too many times to stay quiet. Her words carried the dignity of every marginalized community fighting to be heard in spaces that were never built for them. Against Cruz's condescension, she was the embodiment of unshakable resolve. Proof that representation isn't just symbolic, it's transformative. The contrast was electric. Cruz, sharp with interruptions, tried to paint himself as the authority. But the more he pushed, the more transparent his tactics became. The room could see it. The cameras caught it, and the viewers felt it. This wasn't just about a senator disagreeing with a congresswoman. It was about entitlement colliding with truth, about the power of interruption clashing against the power of perseverance. The hearing room's atmosphere grew taut, like a string, pulled to its breaking point. Every time Cruz leaned in with that smug cadence, Crockett answered not with anger, but with clarity. And in those exchanges, a quiet shift began. People who had tuned in expecting the usual circus of interruptions were beginning to sense something different. Crockett wasn't just holding her ground. She was setting the ground on fire beneath Cruz's feet. By the third interruption, murmurs rippled through the chamber. By the fourth, it was no longer a procedural annoyance, it was a pattern. Cruz wanted control, but Crockett's every measured word reminded the nation that dignity outlasts bluster. And yet, the most dramatic moment hadn't even come. As Cruz pressed harder, as his interruptions mounted, the tension spiraled higher. Viewers leaned closer to their screens, waiting for the moment when Crockett's resolve would transform into something undeniable. What happens in the next exchange changes everything, not just for the hearing, but for the way millions saw Cruz forever. Ted Cruz has never been a stranger to controversy. To his critics, he embodies the archetype of the smug politician. Quick with rehearsed one-liners, eager to dominate the spotlight, and relentless in using procedure as a shield rather than a tool of justice. Over the years, his reputation has grown not as a statesman of solutions, but as a master of obstruction. Filibusters stretched into marathons of self-indulgence, not to advance the people's cause, but to burnish his own image. He relished the performance, even when it meant shutting down government functions or leaving millions in limbo. It wasn't just his politics that drew ire. It was the contradictions. Cruz railed against elites while Ivy League polish dripped from every word. He cast himself as a defender of American grit, yet when Texas was gripped by a deadly winter storm, he boarded a plane to Cancun, abandoning his constituents to freeze while he escaped to luxury. That moment became more than a scandal. It became a symbol. A man entrusted with leadership had revealed in the starkest way just how hollow his claims of service truly were. And still, Cruz carried himself as though untouchable. He thrived on the theater of conflict, inserting himself wherever cameras flashed brightest. From Senate hearings to television studios, he positioned himself as a warrior for truth, even as fact-checkers, colleagues, and constituents rolled their eyes at the hypocrisy. Each smirk, each interruption, each long-winded performance wasn't just political strategy, it was personal branding. Cruz, in his own mind, was the star. To many Americans, though, he had become something else, the living embodiment of a system that rewards arrogance over accountability. Privileged, out of touch, and unwilling to listen. He represented the politician who believes public office is a pedestal rather than a duty. And in this hearing, that archetype was on full display. Cruz wasn't listening. He wasn't debating. In good faith, he was performing, leaning into every stereotype that had made him infamous. But what he didn't realize was that across from him sat someone who had faced down louder bullies, steeper odds, and harsher dismissals than anything he could throw her way. But while Cruz basked in his arrogance, he had no idea Crockett had spent her life preparing for men exactly like him. Jasmine. Crockett's story doesn't begin in the marble halls of Congress. It begins in the grit of working-class America. In a household where every dollar mattered and every lesson carried the weight of survival. Raised in a community where opportunity was never handed out freely, she learned early that strength wasn't about titles or privilege. It was about persistence. Hers was a childhood shaped by the reality of struggle, but also by the unshakable belief that those struggles could forge something greater. She grew up watching how systems bent against people who looked like her, sounded like her, or came from the neighborhoods she called home. Teachers doubted, doors closed, shortcuts never offered, but instead of breaking her, those barriers became fuel. She studied harder, worked longer, spoke louder. Each no was met with a sharper determination to carve a path not just for herself, but for others who had been told the same thing. Law became her weapon. As a civil rights attorney, Crockett stood in courtrooms where power tried to suffocate. Truth, where the poor and marginalized were left voiceless. She wasn't handed prestigious cases. She sought out the ones others ignored, the ones that mattered most to families fighting eviction. 2 workers denied dignity. 2 young people punished for being poor instead of privileged. Each victory, whether large or small, wasn't hers alone. It belonged to a community that finally had someone willing to fight on their terms. In their corner, that journey carried her to the state legislature and then to the United States Congress. She didn't arrive with the wealth of dynasties or the polish of old money, but with the battle scars of a woman who had walked the very roads millions of Americans still walked every day. Her presence in the chamber was more than symbolic. It was defiant. It said to every child who had been told their voice was too small, too rough, or too inconvenient, "You belong here, too." And that's what made her so dangerous to men like Ted Cruz. He came into hearings cushioned by years of privilege. Convinced that interruption could erase opposition, she entered with resilience earned from a lifetime of being underestimated, overlooked, and told to wait her turn. He wielded arrogance. She carried lived truth. Every time Cruz raised his voice to drown her out, he wasn't just clashing with a congresswoman. He was colliding with generations of resilience, with the history of communities that had been silenced and fought to speak again. Crockett's calm wasn't weakness. It was the unshakable calm of someone who had already survived worse storms than Cruz could ever conjure. So as the interruptions piled up, as Cruz leaned in with that familiar smirk, Crockett's resolve only grew sharper. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't shaken. She was ready. And when Cruz came for her again, Crockett knew exactly how to respond. The clash began subtly, almost predictably. Cruz leaned in, his voice pitched just high enough to slice across Crockett's. "Opening remarks, Congresswoman. Let me just stop you right there. First interruption." The words were meant to derail, to signal that whatever she had to say was less important than his need to grandstand. Crockett paused, her gaze locking on him with a calm that was sharper than any rebuttal. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't plead for time. She finished her point with steady precision, making it clear she would not be steamrolled. Cruz smirked, adjusted his chair, and waited for his next opening. Second interruption. He lunged in again, cutting across her. Mid-sentence, tossing out a legalistic phrase meant to sound authoritative. His tone was dripping with condescension, the kind reserved for those he thought he could dismiss. Crockett, unflinching, leaned into her mic and answered with a clipped but pointed remark. It wasn't just substance, it was defiance. Viewers watching at home felt the shift. She wasn't rattled. She was sharpening. By the third interruption, the committee room was buzzing. Cruz didn't bother with pretense anymore. He barreled over her words, his voice growing louder, insistent, as though volume could substitute for truth. Staffers exchanged glances. Cameras panned closer. Crockett let him finish his bluster, then delivered her rebuttal with surgical clarity, slicing through his rhetoric in half the time with double the weight. Fourth interruption. Cruz chuckled under his breath, that familiar air of smug dismissal, and waved his hand as though to brush her aside. But Crockett refused to be brushed. Away. Her tone grew firmer, her eyes brighter. With each exchange, she became not just a participant in a hearing, but the voice of every person who had ever been talked over, sidelined, or dismissed. By the fifth, it was no longer procedural, it was personal. Cruz's words were clipped, impatient, dripping with frustration that his interruptions weren't having the intended effect. He wanted dominance. What America saw was desperation. Crockett, leaning forward now, met him head-on, every syllable landing with force. Her words carried not just argument, but history, the authority of lived struggle, of earned truth. Sixth interruption. Cruz's voice cracked slightly as he raised it, a flash of irritation betraying the mask. He tried to assert the floor, tried to silence her once more, but Crockett refused to yield. She delivered her statement with a calm so commanding that even the gavel seemed redundant. By now, the energy in the room was electric. Journalists typed faster, spectators leaned forward, Social media clips began to circulate in real time. Viewers could sense what was building, not just a clash of personalities, but a collision of worlds. Cruz's arrogance, steeped in privilege, colliding with Crockett's unshakable resilience. 6 times he tried to cut her off. 6 times he failed to silence her. And then, as the tension coiled tighter than ever, Cruz leaned in one last time, ready to deliver the interruption that would, in his mind, finally shut her down. But on the 7th, Crockett struck. Cruz leaned forward with that same practiced smirk, certain this interruption would be the one that broke her rhythm. He spoke over her yet again, words dripping with condescension, his tone thick with self-assurance. But this time, Crockett didn't immediately push back. She let him finish. She let the smugness spill out unchecked until it collapsed under its own weight, and then silence. Her pause was deliberate, a silence that spoke louder than his bluster. Every eye in the chamber locked on her, every camera tilted closer. Cruz shifted in his chair, expecting her to stumble, to fumble, to rush into defense. Instead, she straightened, leaned slightly into the mic, and delivered the line that turned the entire hearing upside down. "Senator, if interrupting me 6 times hasn't helped you make a point, maybe the problem isn't my words, it's that." "You have no answer." The chamber froze. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't rushed. It was calm, razor-sharp, and utterly devastating. For the first time all day, Cruz had no comeback. His mouth opened slightly, but no words followed. The cameras caught everything, the flicker in his eyes, the tightened jaw, the realization that he had walked straight into a trap of his own making. His weapon of interruption had been flipped into his weakness. Crockett didn't stop there. She held his silence in the air like evidence and pressed forward with measured clarity. "You came here to perform? I came here to tell the truth. The truth doesn't need to shout over anyone. It just needs to be heard." Gasps rippled across the room. Staffers froze mid-note. Journalists' fingers flew over keyboards. Knowing instantly this would be the line that trended before the hearing even adjourned, Cruz sat back, visibly unsettled. His smirk was gone, replaced with a stiff attempt at composure. But it was too late. The moment had already been seared into the record and into the consciousness of millions watching. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his arrogance. She defeated him by refusing to play his game, proving that dignity spoken with precision could slice deeper than the loudest interruption. The silence stretched one beat longer, and then the chamber erupted. Some stifled laughter, others murmurs of approval, cameras clicking like firecrackers as the viral moment unfolded in real time. On social media, the clip was already being clipped, captioned, shared. The balance of power in that room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Cruz had tried 7 times to silence her. On the 7th, it was his silence that told the story. The room fell silent, and then it erupted. The moment Crockett's words landed, the ripple effect was immediate. Clips of the exchange shot across Twitter within minutes, hashtags like hashtag Crockett mic drop and hashtag Cruz silenced climbing to the top of trending lists. Millions replayed the footage. On loop, Cruz leaning in, ready to dominate, and Crockett dismantling him with a single, devastating line. Memes flooded timelines. Cruz's frozen expression captioned with phrases like, "when you realize she's got receipts," or "interrupted." One too many times. TikTok creators layered the clip with dramatic music, slow-motion replays, even boxing match commentary. On Instagram, side-by-side screenshots told the story without words, his smirk versus her calm stare. But it wasn't just the internet's humor machine. Activists praised Crockett for what the moment symbolized. This isn't just about one. Hearing one civil rights leader tweeted, "This is about every time a woman of color has been told to stay quiet, and choosing instead to rise." Journalists called it the defining congressional takedown of the year. Even political rivals grudgingly admitted her poise was undeniable. One conservative commentator sighed on air, "Say what you will about Jasmine Crockett, but Cruz got cooked, no question." The virality carried weight beyond entertainment. Late-night hosts replayed the exchange with applause. Editorial boards described it as a turning point in the fight against political arrogance. Young organizers clipped the moment into motivational reels, adding captions like, "Dignity is power. Don't let anyone silence you." Meanwhile, Cruz became the internet's punchline. He was compared to malfunctioning microphones, deflated balloons, even Wi-Fi signals cutting out mid-sentence. For a man who prided himself on sharp retorts, his silence had become his loudest statement, and the world noticed. Still, under the laughter and viral energy, something heavier lingered. This wasn't just about one senator losing a debate or one congresswoman winning a round. The exchange touched a nerve far deeper than memes could capture. But beyond the memes, there was something deeper. Something America desperately needed to hear. The resonance of Crockett's words didn't end with the chamber's eruption or the viral flood of memes. They carried something heavier, something timeless. In a moment meant to humiliate her, she revealed a truth that cut deeper than any interruption. Power without respect is hollow. Cruz's bluster had volume, but no substance. Crockett's voice had dignity, and that dignity became unshakable authority. For millions watching, the scene crystallized a lesson they already knew in their bones. Arrogance can shout, it can interrupt, it can smirk its way through hearings and speeches, but when arrogance meets truth spoken with clarity, it collapses. Crockett didn't just defend her time, she defended the principle that no voice should be silenced because of who carries it. Her restraint was not passivity, was mastery. Her words reminded America that true leadership doesn't require drowning others out. It requires listening, respecting, standing firmly on truth. This wasn't just about Cruz versus Crockett. It was about silencing versus being heard. It's about arrogance versus truth. About the system that rewards those who shout the loudest, and the courage of those who refuse to be shouted down. In Crockett's composure, young women saw permission to speak without apology. Communities long ignored saw validation that their dignity mattered, even in the face of systemic disrespect. Her mic drop wasn't simply a viral moment, it was a reminder of why representation matters. When someone who has walked through struggle enters those marble halls, they bring more than their voice. They carry every story, every fight, every silenced whisper that paved their way. Crockett's victory was not just personal, it was communal. It was the triumph of resilience over entitlement, of justice over showmanship. It was a declaration that democracy only works when the marginalized are not just present, but empowered. Her words echoed long after the cameras shut off. The measure of a leader is not in how loudly they interrupt, but in how firmly they stand for those without a microphone. And this moment did more than humble Cruz, it emboldened America. Derided. The nation that dignity is not weakness, that justice is not noise. And that truth, though interrupted, will always find its way to the surface. For progressives, for immigrants, for every identity-proud American watching, it was proof that the fight is worth it, because victories like this, small or grand, chip away at the arrogance of those who try to silence. In the end, Crockett showed that justice doesn't roar, it resonates. And in that resonance, it cannot be ignored. 6 times, Ted Cruz tried to silence her. But on the 7th, Jasmine Crockett turned his arrogance into his undoing. That moment, the smirk wiped away. The chamber erupting, the internet exploding, wasn't just a debate highlight. It was a reminder of what happens when dignity confronts disrespect, when truth stands taller than arrogance. Crockett didn't need to shout him down. She didn't need theatrics. She needed only one perfectly timed line to show the nation what real power looks like. This is why the moment matters. Because every time someone like Cruz interrupts, dismisses, or tries to dominate, there's a Crockett ready to stand firm. And when she did, she gave a voice to every American who has ever been talked over, overlooked, or told they don't belong at the table. When arrogance tries to silence truth, remember this moment. Truth will always rise, and it will rise through. Those who dare to speak even when the odds and the interruptions stack against them. That's why this story can't stop here. If you believe in dignity over arrogance, in justice over noise, in leaders who carry the voices of the people instead of silencing them, then help amplify this moment. Share this video. Subscribe to join a community that refuses to be drowned out. Add your voice to the millions who believe representation matters, not as a slogan, but as a lived reality. Because this was never just about Cruz and Crockett. It was about us. It's about what we choose to reward, about the kind of democracy we demand, about the legacy we're willing to fight for. Because history is watching, and so are we.